The Everlasting Man, Part 11. Now compared to these wanderers the life of Jesus went as swift and straight as a thunderbolt. It was above all things dramatic. It did above all things consist in doing something that had to be done. It emphatically would not have been done if Jesus had walked about the world forever, doing nothing except tell the truth. And even the external movement of it must not be described as a wandering of the sense of forgetting that it was a journey. This is where it was the fulfillment of the myths rather than of the philosophies. It is a journey with a goal and an object, like Jason going to find the golden fleece, or Hercules the golden apples of the Hesperides. The goal that he was seeking was death. The primary thing that he was going to do was to die. He was going to do other things equally definite and objective. We might also say equally external and material. But from first to last, the most definite fact is that he is going to die. No two things could possibly be more different than the death of Socrates and the death of Christ. We are meant to feel that the death of Socrates was, from the point of view of his friends at least, a stupid muddle and miscarriage of justice, interfering with the flow of a humane and lucid, I had almost said a light, philosophy. We are meant to feel that death was the bride of Christ, as poverty was the bride of St. Francis. We are meant to feel that his life was in that sense a sort of love affair with death, a romance of the pursuit of the ultimate sacrifice. From the moment when the star goes up like a birthday rocket, to the moment when the sun is extinguished like a funeral torch, the whole story moves on wings with the speed and direction of a drama, ending in an act beyond words. Therefore, the story of Christ is the story of a journey, almost in the manner of a military march, certainly in the manner of a quest of a hero moving to his achievement or to his doom. It is a story that begins in the paradise of Galilee, a pastoral and peaceful land having really some hint of Eden, and gradually climbs the rising country into the mountains that are nearer to the storm clouds and the stars, as to a mountain of purgatory. He may be met as if straying in strange places, or stopped on the way for discussion or dispute, but his face is set toward the mountain city. That is the meaning of the great culmination, when he crested the ridge and stood at the turning of the road, and suddenly cried aloud, lamenting over Jerusalem. Some light touch of that lament is in every patriotic poem, or if it is absent, the patriotism stinks with vulgarity. That is the meaning, the stirring and startling incident at the gates of the temple, when the tables were hurled like lumber down the steps, and the rich merchants driven forth with bodily blows. The incident must be at least as much of a puzzle to the pacifists as any paradox about non-resistance can be to any of the militarists. I have compared the quest to the journey of Jason, but we must never forget that in a deeper sense it is rather to be compared to the journey of Ulysses. It was not only a romance of travel, but a romance of return, and the end of usurpation. No healthy boy reading the story regards the rout of the Ithacan suitors as anything but a happy ending. But there are doubtless some who regard the rout of the Jewish merchants and money changers with that refined repugnance which never fails to move them in the presence of violence, and especially of violence against the well-to-do. The point here, however, is that all these incidents have in them a character of mounting crisis. In other words, these incidents are not incidental. When Apollonius, the ideal philosopher, is brought before the judgment seat of Domitian and vanishes by magic, the miracle is entirely incidental. It might have occurred at any time in the wandering life of the Teian. Indeed, I believe it is doubtful in date as well as in substance. The ideal philosopher merely vanished, resumed his ideal existence somewhere else for an indefinite period. It is characteristic of the contrast, perhaps, that Apollonius was supposed to have lived to an almost miraculous old age. Jesus of Nazareth was less prudent in his miracles. When Jesus was brought before the judgment seat of Pontius Pilate, he did not vanish. It was the crisis and the goal. It was the hour and the power of darkness. It was the supremely supernatural act of all his miraculous life that he did not vanish. Every attempt to amplify that story has diminished it. The task has been attempted by many men of real genius and eloquence, as well as by only too many vulgar sentimentalists and self-conscious rhetoricians. The tale has been retold with patronizing pathos by the elegant skeptics, with fluent enthusiasm by boisterous best-sellers. It will not be retold here. The grinding power of the plain words of the gospel is like the power of the millstones, and those who can read them simply enough will feel as if rocks had been rolled upon them. Criticism is only words about words, and of what use the words about such words as these? What is the use of word painting about the dark garden filled suddenly with torchlight and furious faces? Are you come out with sword and staves as against a robber? All day I sat in your temple teaching, and you took me not. Can anything be added to the massive and gathered restraint of that irony? Like a great wave lifted to the sky and refusing to fall. Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. As the high priest asked what further need he had of witnesses, we might well ask what further need we have of words. Peter in a panic repudiated him, and immediately the cock crew. And Jesus looked upon Peter, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. Has anyone any further remarks to offer? Just before the murder he prayed for all the murderous race of men, saying, "They know not what they do." Is there anything to say to that, except that we know as little what we say? Is there any need to repeat and spin out the story of how the tragedy trailed up the Via Dolorosa, and how they threw him haphazard with two thieves in one of the ordinary batches of execution? and how in all that horror and howling wilderness of desertion one voice spoke in homage, a startling voice from the very last place where it was looked for, the gibbet of the criminal. As and he said to that nameless ruffian, "This night thou shalt be with me in paradise." Is there anything to put after that but a full stop? Or is anyone prepared to answer adequately that farewell gesture to all flesh which created for his mother a new son? It is more within my powers, and here more immediately to my purpose, to point out that in that scene were symbolically gathered all the human forces that have been vaguely sketched in this story. As kings and philosophers and the popular element had been symbolically present at his birth, so they were more practically concerned in his death. And with that we come face to face with the essential fact to be realized. All the great groups that stood out about the cross represent in one way or another the great historical truth of the time, that the world could not save itself. Man can do no more. Rome and Jerusalem and Athens and everywhere else were going down like a sea turned into a slow cataract. Externally, indeed, the ancient world was still at its strongest. It is always at that moment that the inmost weakness begins. But in order to understand that weakness, we must repeat what has been said more than once, that it was not the weakness of a thing originally weak. It was emphatically the strength of the world that was turned to weakness, and the wisdom of the world that was turned to folly. In this story of Good Friday, it is the best thing in the world that are at their worst. That is what really shows us the world at its worst. It was, for instance, the priests of a true monotheism and the soldiers of an international civilization. Rome, the legend, founded upon fallen Troy and triumphant over fallen Carthage, had stood for a heroism which was the nearest that any pagan ever came to chivalry. Rome had defended the household gods and the human decencies against the ogres of Africa and the hermaphrodite monstrosities of Greece. But in the lightning flash of this incident, we see great Rome, the imperial republic, going downward under her Lucretian doom. Skepticism has eaten away even the confident sanity of the conquerors of the world. He who is enthroned to say, "What is justice?" can only ask, "What is truth?" So in that drama which decided the whole fate of antiquity, one of the central figures is fixed in what seems to be the reverse of his true role. Rome is almost another name for responsibility, yet he stands forever as a sort of rocking statue of the irresponsible. Man can do no more. Even the practical had become the impracticable. Standing between the pillars of his own judgment seat, a Roman had washed his hands of the world. There were two priests of that pure and original truth that was behind all the mythologies, like the sky behind the clouds. It was the most important truth in the world, and even that could not save the world. Perhaps there is something overpowering in pure personal theism like seeing the sun and the moon and the sky come together to form one staring face. Perhaps the truth is too tremendous, when not broken by some intermediaries, divine or human. Perhaps it is merely too pure and far away. Anyhow, it could not save the world. It could not even conquer the world. There were philosophers who held it in its highest and noblest form, but they could not convert the world. But they never tried. You could no more fight the jungle of popular mythology with a private opinion than you could clear away a forest with a pocket knife. The Jewish priests had guarded it jealously in the good and the bad sense. They had kept it as a gigantic secret. As savage heroes might have kept the sun in a box, they kept the everlasting in the tabernacle. They were proud that they alone could look upon the blinding sun of a single deity, and they did not know that they had themselves gone blind. Since that day their representatives have been like blind men in broad daylight, striking to the right and left with their staffs and cursing the darkness. But there has been that in their monumental monotheism that it has at least remained like a monument, the last thing of its kind, and in a sense motionless with the more restless world which it cannot satisfy. For it is certain that for some reason it cannot satisfy. Since that day it has never been quite enough to say that God is in his heaven and all is right with the world, since the rumor that God had left his heavens to set it right. And as it was with these powers that were good, or at least had once been good, so it was with the element which, perhaps the best, or which Christ himself seems certainly to have felt as the best. The poor to whom he preached the good news, the common people who heard him gladly, the populace that had made so many popular heroes and demigods in the old pagan world, showed also the weakness that were dissolving the world. They suffered the evils often seen in the mob of the city, and especially the mob of the capital, during the decline of a society. The same thing that makes the rural population live on tradition makes the urban population live on rumor. Just as myths, as at the best has been irrational, so its likes and dislikes are easily changed by baseless assertion that is arbitrary without being authoritative. Some brigand or other was artificially turned into a picturesque and popular figure and run as a kind of candidate against Christ. In all this we recognize the urban population that we know, with its newspaper scares and scoops. But there was present in this ancient population an evil more peculiar to the ancient world. We have noted it already as the neglect of the individual, even of the individual voting the condemnation, and still more of the individual condemned. It was the soul of the hive, a heathen thing. The cry of this spirit was also heard in that hour. It is well that one man die for the people. Yet this spirit in antiquity of devotion to the city and to the state had also been in itself and in its time a noble spirit. It had its poets and its martyrs, men still to be honored forever. It was failing through its weakness in not seeing the separate soul of a man, the shrine of all mysticism, but it was only failing as everything else was failing. The mob went along with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the philosophers and the moralists. It went along with the imperial magistrates and the sacred priests, the scribes and the soldiers, that the one universal human spirit might suffer a universal condemnation, that there might be one deep, unanimous chorus of approval and harmony when man was rejected by men. There were solitudes beyond where none shall follow. There were secrets in the inmost and invisible part of that drama that have no symbol in speech, or in any severance of a man from men. Nor is it easy for any words less stark and single-minded than those of the naked narrative even to hint at the horror of exaltation that lifted itself above the hill. Endless expositions have not come to the end of it, or even to the beginning. And if there be any sound that can produce a silence, we may surely be silent about the end and the extremity. When a cry was driven out of that darkness in words dreadfully distinct and dreadfully unintelligible, which man shall never understand in all the eternity they have purchased for him, and for one annihilating instant an abyss that is not for our thoughts had opened even in the unity of the Absolute, and God had been forsaken by God. They took down the body from the cross, and one of the few rich men among the first Christians obtained permission to bury it in a rock tomb in his garden. Romans setting a military guard lest there should be some riot and attempt to recover the body. There was once more a natural symbolism in these natural proceedings. It was well that the tomb should be sealed with all the secrecy of an ancient Eastern sepulchre and guarded by the authority of the Caesars. For in that second cavern the whole of that great and glorious humanity which we call antiquity was gathered up and covered over, and in that place it was buried. It was the end of a very great thing called human history, the history that was merely human. The mythologies and philosophies were buried there, the gods and the heroes and the sages. In the great Roman phrase, they had lived, but as they could only live, so they could only die, and they were dead. On the third day, the friends of Christ coming at daybreak to the place, found an empty grave and the stone rolled away. In varying ways they realized the new wonder, but even they hardly realized that the world had died in the night. What they were looking at was the first day of a new creation, with a new heaven and a new earth. And in a semblance of the gardener, God walked again in the garden, in the cool not of the evening, but the dawn. Chapter 4. The Witness of the Heretics. Christ founded the church with two great figures of speech. In the final words to the apostles who received authority to found it, the first was the phrase about founding it on Peter as on a rock. The second was the symbol of the keys. About the meaning of the former there is naturally no doubt in my own case, but it does not differ directly affect the argument here, save in two more secondary aspects. It is yet another example of a thing that could only fully expand and explain itself afterwards, and even long afterwards. And it is yet another example of something the very reverse of simple and self-evident, even in the language, insofar as it described a man as a rock when he had much more the appearance of a reed. But the other image of the keys has an exactitude that has hardly been exactly noticed. The keys have been conspicuous enough in the art and heraldry of Christendom, but not everyone has noted the peculiar aptness of the allegory. We have now reached the point in history where something must be said of the first appearance and activities of the Church in the Roman Empire. And for that brief description, nothing could be more perfect than that ancient metaphor. The early Christian was very precisely a person carrying about a key, or what he said was a key. The whole Christian movement consisted in claiming to possess that key. It was not merely a vague forward movement, which might be better represented by a battering ram. It was not something that swept along with its similar or dissimilar things, as does a modern social movement. As we shall see in a moment, it rather definitely refused to do so. It definitely asserted that there was a key, and that it possessed that key, and that no other key was like it. In that sense, it was as narrow as you please. Only it happened to be the key that could unlock the prison of the whole world, and let in the white daylight of liberty. The creed was like a key in three respects, which can be most conveniently summed up under this symbol. First, a key is above all things, a thing with a shape. It is a thing that depends entirely upon keeping its shape. The Christian creed is above all things the philosophy of shapes and the enemy of shapelessness. But where it differs from all that formless infinity, Manichaean or Buddhist, which makes a sort of pool of night in the dark heart of Asia, an ideal of uncreating all the creatures. That is where it differs also from the analogous vagueness of mere evolution, the idea of creatures constantly losing their shape. A man told his solitary latchkey had been melted down with 1,000,000 others into a Buddhistic unity would be annoyed. But a man told that his key was gradually growing and sprouting in his pocket and branching into new wards or complication would not be more gratified. Second, the shape of a key is in itself a rather fantastic shape. A savage who did not know it was a key would have the greatest difficulty in guessing what it could possibly be. And it is fantastic because it is in a sense arbitrary. A key is not a matter of abstractions. In that sense, a key is not a matter of argument. It either fits the lock or it doesn't. It is useless for men to stand disputing over it, considered by itself, or reconstructing it on pure principles of geometry and decorative art. It is senseless for a man to say that he would like a simple key. It would be far more sensible to do his best with a crowbar. And thirdly, as the key is necessarily a thing with a pattern, so this was one having in some ways a rather elaborate pattern. When people complain of the religion being so early complicated with theology and things of the kind, They forget that the world had not only got into a hole, but had got into a whole maze of holes and corners. The problem itself was a complicated problem. It did not, in the ordinary sense, merely involve anything so simple as sin. It was also full of secrets, of unexplored and unfathomable fallacies, of unconscious mental diseases, of dangers in all directions. If the faith had faced the world only with the platitudes about peace and simplicity that some moralists would confine it to, it would not have had the faintest effect on that luxurious and labyrinthine lunatic asylum. What did it do, we must now roughly describe. It is enough to say that there was undoubtedly much about the key that seemed complex. Indeed, there was only one thing about it that was simple. It opened the door. There are certainly recognized and accepted statements in this matter, which may for brevity and convenience be described as lies. We have all heard people say that Christianity arose in an age of barbarism. They might just as well say that Christian Science arose in an age of barbarism. They may think Christianity was a symptom of social decay, as I think Christian Science is a symptom of mental decay. They may think Christianity a superstition that ultimately destroyed a civilization, as I think Christian Science is a superstition capable, if taken seriously, of destroying any number of civilizations. But to say that a Christian of the 4th or 5th centuries was a barbarian living in a barbarous time is exactly like saying Mrs. Eddy was a Red Indian. And if I allowed my constitutional impatience with Mrs. Eddy to impel me to call her a Red Indian, I should incidentally be telling a lie. We may like or dislike the imperial civilization of Rome in the 4th century. We may like or dislike the industrial civilization of America in the 19th century. That they both were what we commonly mean by a civilization, no person of common sense could deny it if he wanted to. This is a very obvious fact, but it is also a very fundamental one. We must make it the foundation of any further description of constructive Christianity in the past. For good or evil, it was preeminently the product of a civilized age, perhaps of an over-civilized age. This is the first fact apart from all praise or blame. Indeed, I am so fortunate as not to feel that I praise a thing when I compare it to Christian Science. But it is at least desirable to know something of the savor of a society in which we are condemning or praising anything, and the science that connects Mrs. Eddy with tomahawks or the Mater della Rosa with totems may, for our general convenience, be eliminated. The dominant fact, not merely about the Christian religion, but about the whole pagan civilization, was that it had been more than once repeated in these pages. The Mediterranean was a lake, in the real sense of a pool, in which a number of different cults or cultures were, as the phrase goes, pooled. Those cities facing each other round the circle of the lake became more and more one cosmopolitan culture. On its legal and military side, it was the Roman Empire, but it was very many-sided. It might be called superstitious in the sense that it contained a great number of varied superstitions, but by no possibility can any part of it be called barbarous? In this level of cosmopolitan culture arose the Christian religion and the Catholic Church, and everything in this story suggests that it was felt to be something new and strange. Those who have tried to suggest that it evolved out of something much milder or more ordinary have found that in this case their evolutionary method is very difficult to apply. They may suggest that Essenes or Ebionites or such things were the seed, but the seed is invisible. The tree appears very rapidly full grown, and the tree is something totally different. It is certainly a Christmas tree in the sense that it keeps the kindliness and moral beauty of the story of Bethlehem. But it was as ritualistic as the seven-branched candlestick, and the candles it carried were considerably more than were probably permitted by the first prayer book of Edward VI. It might well be asked, indeed, why anyone accepting the Bethlehem tradition should object to golden or gilded ornaments since the Magi themselves brought gold, why he should dislike incense in the church since incense was brought even to the stable. But these are controversies that do not concern me here. I am concerned only with the historical fact, more and more admitted by historians, that very early in its history this thing became visible to the civilization of antiquity, and that already the church appeared as a church, with everything that is implied in a church and much that is disliked in a church. We will discuss in a moment how far it was like other ritualistic or magical or ascetical mysteries in its own time. It was certainly not in the least like merely ethical or idealistic movements in our time. It had a doctrine, it had a discipline, it had sacraments, it had degrees of initiation, it admitted people and expelled people. It affirmed one dogma with authority and repudiated another with anathemas. Of all these things be the marks of Antichrist. The reign of Antichrist followed very rapidly upon Christ. Those who maintain that Christianity was not a church but a moral movement of idealists have been forced to push the period of its perversion or disappearance further and further back. A bishop of Rome writes claiming authority in the very lifetime of St. John the Evangelist, and it is described as the first papal aggression. A friend of the apostles writes of them as men he knew and says they taught him the doctrine of the sacrament, and Mr. Wells can only murmur that the reaction towards barbaric blood rites may have happened rather earlier than might be expected. The date of the fourth gospel, which at one time was steadily growing later and later, is now steadily growing earlier and earlier, until critics are staggering at the dawning and dreadful possibility that it might be something like what it professes to be. The last limit of an early date for the extinction of true Christianity was probably been found by the latest German professor whose authority is invoked by Dean Inge. This learned scholar says that Pentecost was the occasion for the first founding of an ecclesiastical, dogmatic, and despotic church, utterly alien to the simple ideas of Jesus of Nazareth. This may be called, in popular as well as a learned sense, the limit. What do professors of this kind imagine that men are made of? Suppose it were a matter of any merely human movement. Let us say that of the conscientious objectors. Some say the early Christians were pacifists. I do not believe it for a moment, but I am quite ready to accept the parallel for the sake of argument. Tolstoy, or some great preacher of peace among peasants, has been shot as a mutineer for defying conscription, and a little while afterwards his fellow followers meet together in an upper room in remembrance of him. They never had any reason for coming together except that common memory. They are men of many kinds, with nothing to bind them, except that the greatest event in all their lives was this tragedy of the teacher of universal peace. They were always repeating his words, revolving his problems, trying to imitate his character. The pacifists meet at their Pentecost and are possessed of a sudden ecstasy of enthusiasm and a wild rush of the whirlwind of inspiration, in the course of which they proceed to establish universal conscription, to increase the navy estimates, to insist on everybody going about armed to the teeth, and on all frontiers bristling with artillery. The proceedings concluded with the singing of "The Boys of the Bulldog Breed" and "Don't Let Them Scrap the British Navy." That is something like a fair parallel to the theory of these critics, that the transition from their idea of Jesus to their idea of Catholicism could have been made in the little upper room at Pentecost. Surely anybody's common sense would tell him that enthusiasts who only met through their common enthusiasm for a leader whom they loved would not instantly rush away to establish everything that he hated. No, if the ecclesiastical and dogmatic system is as old as Pentecost, it is as old as Christmas. If we trace it back to such very early Christians, we must trace it back to Christ. We may begin, then, with these two negations. It is nonsense to say that the Christian faith appeared in a simple age, in the sense of an unlettered and gullible age. It is equally nonsense to say that the Christian faith was a simple thing, in the sense of a vague or childish or merely instinctive thing. Perhaps the only point in which we could possibly say that the Church fitted into the pagan world is the fact that they were both not only highly civilized, but rather complicated. They were both emphatically many-sided, but antiquity was then a many-sided whole, like a hectagonal whole waiting for an equally hectagonal stopper. In that sense, only the Church was many-sided enough to fit the world. The 6 sides of the Mediterranean world faced each other across the sea and waited for something that should look all ways at once. The Church had to be both Roman and Greek and Jewish and African and Asiatic. In the very words of the Apostle of the Gentiles, it was indeed all things to all men. Christianity, then, was not merely crude and simple, as was the very reverse of the growth of a barbaric time. But when we come to the contrary charge, we come to a much more plausible charge. It is very much more tenable that the faith was but the final phase of the decay of civilization, in the sense of the excess of civilization, that this superstition was a sign that Rome was dying, and dying of being much too civilized. It is an argument much better worth considering, and we shall proceed to consider it. At the beginning of this book, I ventured on a general summary of it, in a parallel between the rise of humanity out of nature and the rise of Christianity out of history. I pointed out that in both cases what had gone before might imply something coming after, but it did not in the least imply what did come after. If a detached mind had seen certain apes, it might have deduced more anthropoids. It would not have deduced man or anything within 1,000 miles of what man had done. In short, it might have seen Pithecanthropus, or the missing link, looming in the future, if possible almost as dimly and doubtfully as we see him looming in the past. But if it foresaw him appearing, it would also foresee him disappearing, and leaving a few faint traces, just as he had left a few faint traces, if they are traces. To foresee that missing link would not be to foresee man, or anything like man. Now this earlier explanation must be kept in mind, because it is an exact parallel to the true view of the Church, and the suggestion of it having evolved naturally out of the empire in decay. The truth in that is, in one sense, a man might very well have predicted that the imperial decadence would produce something like Christianity. That is, something a little like and gigantically different. A man might very well have said, for instance, pleasure has been pursued so extravagantly that there will be a reaction into pessimism. Perhaps it will take the form of asceticism. Men will mutilate themselves instead of merely hanging themselves. Or a man might very reasonably have said, if we weary of our Greek and Latin gods, we shall be hankering after some Eastern mystery or other. There will be a fashion in Persians or Hindus. Or a man of the world might well have been shrewd enough to say, powerful people are picking up these fads. Some day the court will adopt one of them, and it may become official. Or yet another and gloomier prophet might be pardoned for saying, the world is going downhill. Dark and barbarous superstitions will return. It does not matter much which. They will all be formless and fugitive, like dreams of the night. Now it is the intense interest of the case that all these prophecies were really fulfilled. But it was not the Church that fulfilled them. It was the Church that escaped from them, confounded them, and rose above them in triumph. Insofar as it was probable that the mere nature of hedonism would produce a mere reaction of asceticism, it did produce a mere reaction of asceticism. It was the movement called Manichaean, and the Church was its mortal enemy. Insofar as it would have naturally appeared at that point in history, it did appear. It did also disappear, which was equally natural. The mere pessimist reaction did come with the Manichees, and did go with the Manichees. But the Church did not come with them or go with them, and she had much more to do with them going than with their coming. Or again, it is so far as it was probable that even the growth of skepticism would bring in a fashion of Eastern religion, it did bring it in. Mithras became from far beyond Palestine out of the heart of Persia, bringing strange mysteries of the blood of bulls. Certainly there was everything to show that such fashion would have come in any case, but certainly there is nothing in the world to show that it would not have passed away in any case. Certainly an Oriental fad was something eminently fitted to the 4th or 5th century. But that hardly explains it having remained to the 20th century, and still going strong. In short, in so far as things of the kind might have been expecting, then, things like Mithraism were experienced then. But it scarcely explains our more recent experiences. And if we were still Mithraists, merely because Mithraic headdresses and other Persian apparatuses might be expected to be all the rage in the days of Domitian, it would almost seem by this time that we must be a little dowdy. It is the same, as will be suggested in a moment, with the idea of official favoritism. Insofar as such favoritism shown towards a fad was something that might have been looked for during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it was something that did exist in the empire, and did decline and fall with it. It throws no sort of light on the thing that resolutely refuses to decline and fall. That grew steadily while the other was declining and falling, and which even at this moment is going forward with fearless energy, when another eon had completed its cycle and another civilization seems almost ready to fall or to decline. Now the curious fact is this, that the very heresies in which the Church is blamed for crushing testify to the unfairness for which she is blamed. Insofar as something deserved the blame, it was precisely the things that she is blamed for blaming. Insofar as something was merely a superstition, she herself condemned that superstition. Insofar as something was mere reaction into barbarism, she herself resisted it because it was a reaction into barbarism. Insofar as something was a fad of the fading empire that died and deserved to die, it was the Church alone that killed it. The Church is reproached for being exactly what the heresy was repressed for being. The explanation of the evolutionary historians and higher critics do really explain why Arianism and Gnosticism and Nestorianism were born, and also why they died. They do not explain why the Church was born or why she has refused to die. Above all, they do not explain why she should have made war on the very evils she is supposed to share. Let us take a few practical examples of the principle. The principle that if there was anything that was really a superstition of the dying empire, it did really die with the dying empire, and certainly was not the same as the very thing that destroyed it. For this purpose, we will take in order 2 or 3 of the most ordinary explanations of Christian origins among the modern critics of Christianity. Nothing is more common, for instance, than to find such a modern critic writing something like this. Christianity was above all a movement of ascetics, a rush into the desert, a refuge in the cloister, a renunciation of all life and happiness, and this was a part of a gloomy and inhuman reaction against nature itself, a hatred of the body, a horror of the material universe, a sort of universal suicide of the senses and even of the self. It came from an Eastern fanaticism like that of the fakirs, and was ultimately founded on an Eastern pessimism which seems to feel existence itself as an evil. Now the most extraordinary thing about this is that it's all quite true. It is true in every detail except that it happens to be attributed entirely to the wrong person. It is not true of the Church, but it is true of the heretics condemned by the Church. It is as if one were to write a most detailed analysis of the mistakes and misgovernment of the ministers of George III, merely with the small inaccuracy that the whole story was told about George Washington. Or if somebody made a list of the crimes of the Bolsheviks with no variation except they were all attributed to the Tsar. The early church was indeed very ascetic, in connection with a totally different philosophy. But the philosophy of a war on life and nature as such really did exist in the world, if the critics only knew where to look for it. What really happened was this. When the faith first emerged into the world, the first thing that happened to it was that it was caught in a swarm of mystical and metaphysical sects, mostly out of the East, like one lonely golden bee caught in a swarm of wasps. To the ordinary onlooker, there did not seem to be much difference, or anything beyond a general buzz. Indeed, in a sense, there was not much difference so far as stinging and being stung were concerned. The difference was that only one golden dot in all that whirring gold dust had the power of going forth to make hives for all humanity, to give the world honey and wax, or, as was so finely said in a context too easily forgotten, the two noblest things, which are sweetness and light. The wasps all died that winter, and half the difficulty is that hardly anyone knows anything about them, and most people do not know that they ever existed. So that the whole story of that first phase of our religion is lost. Or, to vary the metaphor, when this movement, or some other movement, pierced the dike between the East and the West, and brought more mystical ideas into Europe, it brought with it a whole flood of other mystical ideas besides its own, most of them ascetical, and nearly all of them pessimistic. They very nearly flooded and overwhelmed the purely Christian element. They came mostly from that region that was sort of dim borderland between the Eastern philosophies and the Eastern mythologies, and which shared with the wilder assumptions that curious crave for making fantastic patterns of the cosmos in the shape of maps and genealogical trees. Those that are supposed to derive from the mysterious mains are called Manichaean. Kindred cults are more generally known as Gnostic. They are mostly of a labyrinthine complexity, but the point to insist on is the pessimism. The fact that nearly all, in one form or another, regarded the creation of the world as a work of an evil spirit. Some of them had that Asiatic atmosphere that surrounds Buddhism, the suggestion that life is a corruption of the purity of being. Some of them suggested a purely spiritual order which had been betrayed by the coarse and clumsy trick of making such toys as the sun and the moon and the stars. Anyhow, all this dark tide out of the metaphysical sea in the mists of Asia poured through the dikes simultaneously with the creed of Christ. But it is the whole point of the story that the two were not the same, that they flowed like oil and water. That creed remained in the shape of a miracle, a river still flowing through the sea, and the proof of the miracle was a practical once more. It was merely that while all the sea was salt and bitter with the savor of death, this one stream in the midst of it man could drink. Now that purity was preserved by dogmatic definitions and exclusions, it could not possibly have been preserved by anything else. If the Church had not renounced the Manichaeans, it might have become merely Manichaean. If it had not renounced the Gnostics, it might have become Gnostic. But by the very fact that it did renounce them, it proved that it was either Gnostic nor Manichaean. At any rate, it proved that something was not either Gnostic or Manichaean, and that it could be that condemned them, if it was not the original good news of the runners of Bethlehem and the trumpet of resurrection. The early church was ascetic, but she proved that she was not pessimistic, simply by condemning the pessimists. The creed declared that man was sinful, but it did not declare that life was evil, and it proved it by damning those who did. The condemnation of the earlier heretics is itself condemned as something crabbed and narrow. But it was in truth the very proof that the church meant to be brotherly and broad. It proved that the primitive Catholics were especially eager to explain that they did not think man utterly vile, that they did not think life incurably miserable, that they did not think marriage a sin or procreation a tragedy. They were ascetic because asceticism was the only possible purge of the sins of the world. But in the very thunder of their anathemas, they affirmed forever that their asceticism was not to be anti-human or anti-natural, that they did wish to purge the world and not destroy it. And nothing else except those anathemas could possibly have made it clear, amid a confusion which still confuses them with their mortal enemies. Nothing else but dogma could have resisted the riot of imaginative invention with which the pessimists were waging their war against nature, with their eons and their demiurge, their strange logos and the sinister Sophia. If the church had not insisted on theology, it would have melted into a mad mythology of the mystics. Yet further removed from the reason or even from rationalism, and, above all yet, further removed from life and from the love of life. Remember that it would have been an inverted mythology, one contradicting everything natural in paganism, a mythology in which Pluto would be above Jupiter and Hades hang higher than Olympus, in which Brahma and all that has the breath of life would be subject to Siva, shining with the eye of death. That the early church was itself full of an ecstatic enthusiasm for renunciation and virginity makes this distinction much more striking, and not less so. It makes all the more the place where the dogma drew the line. A man might crawl about on all fours like a beast because he was an ascetic. He might stand night and day on the top of a pillar and be adored for being an ascetic, but he would not say that the world was a mistake or the marriage state of sin without being a heretic. What was it that thus deliberately disengaged itself from Eastern asceticism by sharp definition and fierce refusal, if it was not something with an individuality of his own, and one that was quite different? If the Catholics are to be confused with the Gnostics, we can only say that it was not their fault if they are. And it is rather hard that the Catholics should be blamed by the same critics for persecuting the heretics and also for sympathizing with the heresy. The church was not a Manichaean movement, if only because it was not a movement at all. It was not even merely an ascetical movement, because it was not a movement at all. It would be nearer the truth to call it the tamer of asceticism than the mere leader or loosener of it. There was a thing having its own theory of asceticism, its own type of asceticism, but most conspicuous at the moment as the moderator of other theories and types. This was the only sense that can be made, for instance, of the story of St. Augustine. As long as he was merely a man of the world, a mere man drifting with his time, he actually was a Manichaean. It really was quite modern and fashionable to be a Manichaean. But when he became a Catholic, the people he instantly turned on and rent in pieces were the Manichaeans. The Catholic way of putting it is that he left off being a pessimist to become an ascetic. But as the pessimist interpreted asceticism, it ought to be said that he left off being an ascetic to become a saint. The war upon life, the denial of nature, were exactly the things he had already found in the heathen world outside the church, and had to renounce when he entered the church. The very fact that St. Augustine remains a somewhat sterner or sadder figure than St. Francis or St. Teresa only accentuates the dilemma. Face to face with the gravest or even grimmest of Catholics, we can still ask, why did Catholicism make war on Manichees, if Catholicism was Manichaean?